Hello, everybody. Welcome back. ATSV 2021. It's great. Julie, do you realize we have been doing this for over 5 years now? Isn't that crazy?
No, but isn't that terrific?
Yeah. Very happy to be here still, and looking forward to seeing everybody in person next year. But everybody, welcome back. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, an apparel textile sourcing veteran, as we like to say. There's a couple of you who have been with us since the beginning. Um, very, very big voice in terms of trade policy and how it affects the apparel industry. So I'd like to welcome Julia K. Hughes. She's the president of the United States Fashion Industry Association, or USFIA. She'll be talking today about Washington trade policy perspectives. It's always very, very informative and interesting to see how the political and economic climate is shifting, and Julia and the people she works with are definitely at the forefront of what's going on and what's to come. So looking forward to your presentation, Julia. It's very good to see you again. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and it's great to join you and everybody who has dialed in and who's on Facebook Live. All right, so here's now the one moment where things can go awry, which is getting the presentation.
Hooray.
There we go.
There you
Okay.
go.
So as Jason said, the topic that I have is talking about Washington trade policy perspectives. And so just, a few words here in the beginning. U.S. Fashion Industry Association, our motto is fashion made possible by global trade. And that really summarizes what we do and our mission. We focus on communication, sharing information and updates with members, education, a lot of webinars, particularly these last few years, and virtual events, hopefully in-person events soon. And of course, advocacy when there are issues that are important for the industry that we hear from members and those of you in the trade about, that we can share that with decision makers here in DC. So today, just to kind of put a frame on the discussion of what are the trends and the challenges this year, I think we really want to look at, how you're building new sourcing strategies, what's the latest in the trade wars, and what is a new trade policy going forward with the new administration. So earlier this year, we asked companies to share their top business challenges. And so I kind of want to just start there and state the obvious that, of course, COVID-19 impact on business and on the economy is the top concern, the top challenge this year. That's no surprise to anybody here. Also, what are managing risks? Risks from the potential for forced labor in the supply chain is a huge concern, and then also increasing costs. So mainly logistic costs and delays in the supply chain have really been hitting us hard so far this year, but increasing other costs as well, although I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So this kind of gives a frame to what are companies thinking about, what are some of the business challenges, and then what does that mean from the sourcing and the trade policy perspective? So first, those of you who've been participating in all of these sessions, you've heard a number of folks talk about their insights on what's happening with the Biden administration and in DC. So I thought I would kick off looking a little bit at the sourcing insights and what's really happening in sourcing. So actually for our members, we just released a report looking at the sourcing trends for the first quarter of 2021. That's the most recent data that's available by the US government. And I think it gives us a chance to kind of analyze what's happening and what's the response. How are we getting back from COVID? And we saw 5 key sourcing trends. And some of these trends have been consistent for years, probably consistent, certainly consistent since the first time I spoke at the Miami show. China remains the top supplier, but Asian apparel suppliers continue to grow. Average unit values continue to fall for most textile and apparel products and for most of the key suppliers, which I think is an interesting trend that's counter to kind of the anxiety and what's going on in the rest of our business. Apparel imports are surging as the recovery expands. And then, despite high duty rates, companies aren't utilizing free trade agreements and preference programs as much as you would imagine. And I think that that's really important. If we were in Miami, we'd be talking, and we'll talk a bit about Western Hemisphere. So, kind of the first trend, China remains the top supplier. So, what are the statistics? A little surprising to me, even that by quantity for the first quarter, for the first 3 months of 2021, China supplied 43% of the total imports, and the second ranked supplier was India, but they had 10%. So that's healthy, but still, China overwhelmingly is the top supplier by quantity. By value, the story's a little different, with China supplying just over a quarter of the value of the textile and apparel imports, and Vietnam ranking second with 15%. China, though, is the top supplier of all apparel to the US market. A third of our apparel imports come from China. The top supplier of fabric, almost a third of our fabric imports come from China. And more than 2/3 of our made-ups and home textiles that are imported to the US come from China. So China remains the top supplier. Good to remember as we look at the trends. But the Asian apparel suppliers continue to grow. And if we look at the growth rate for the top, I picked the top 8 apparel suppliers because the top 7 are all Asia or South Asia. And so the majority of US apparel imports are coming from Asia today. So you look at the share of China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, obviously the largest, but Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, all very strong and growing suppliers to the US market for apparel. The first Western Hemisphere, the largest Western Hemisphere supplier is Honduras, that ranks 8th. But average unit values are continuing to fall for most products and most suppliers. So if we look at the product breakdown for the first quarter of 2021 versus the first quarter of 2020, only the average unit value of yarns went up. The total value was down by 18%, apparel average unit value down, fabrics down, made-ups down. So kind of across the board, even though we're worried about rising costs, and if we talk in macroeconomic terms, there are worries about inflation, we're not really seeing that yet in the average unit values for the imports of textiles and apparel. And if we dive in on apparel and we look at all apparel and then also what are the top apparel suppliers, the same largest 8 again. I mean, what I think is pretty amazing for the quarter is so the average unit value from China is down 16% for the quarter. And the average unit value for India is down 10% for the quarter. So interesting dynamic now is this, because we have shifts in the types of products that we're importing. That may be part of it. Are there shifts in the negotiations, right? And kind of what the demand piece that is pushing the average unit values down. But the fact that this is a trend across the board, I think is really interesting and something to think about as you're looking at your sourcing strategy. So how much do you have to be concerned about rising costs today? And you'll note again, it's the only one of the top 8 suppliers where the average unit value is higher this year than the first quarter last year is Honduras, our Western Hemisphere supplier. So in addition to we're seeing those low average unit values, we're also seeing imports surge as the recovery expands. Not really a surprise, right, after what happened last year. But for the first quarter, so for the first 3 months, and these are ranked by order of the increase. So China, the largest supplier of apparel, also had the biggest increase in imports during the first 3 months of 2021. But we also saw, these are all double-digit increases from countries, suppliers as different as Peru, Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So a really interesting story and a very broad story of the increase in imports this year. But if we look at just the month of March, and I had to include this number, even though for the most part, I want to be talking about the quarter, not just a single month. For the month of March, wow, imports from China up 174% compared to 1 year ago. Imports from Italy up, right, 67%. We're seeing huge numbers for the month of March, which I think is reflecting, all right, we're in the recovery. Companies are starting to report, right? Sales are expanding. People are vaccinated. They're ready to go back to the mall and to go in the store to shop. Even so, these are some pretty amazing increases in imports. And then the one thing that I think it disappoints me, I wish, since we've participated in the negotiations for free trade agreements and preference programs, I wish there was greater usage of the free trade agreements. But the complex rules of origin obviously play a role, and the administrative costs obviously play a role. So, are the imports, though, are predominantly Western Hemisphere, CAFTA, and our USMCA or NAFTA imports are the largest share for duty-free imports to the US in the first 3 months of 2021, with AGOA, Egypt, Haiti, and Jordan kind of the next largest, although none of those over 10%, unfortunately. So for me, this is a focus, I think, for the association this year to look at how can we help members, how can we help the industry to use the duty-free programs even more. So that's kind of my summary of, so where are we in sourcing? Because I think there are interesting trends and not necessarily what you may think. But let's turn to trade policy and how does that relate to the sourcing as well? So unfortunately, while I kick this off talking about the new administration and what's happening in Washington on trade policy, the tariffs and the trade wars are not over. As much as I might have liked, one of the day one things for the president to do is to get rid of the 301 tariffs and say we're going to end the trade wars. That isn't where the policy has gone yet. We are still relatively locked in place where we were with the previous administration. And I don't think this is the entire reason why, although part of the reason why is that the tariffs mean that the US is collecting a lot more in additional tariffs. Since the start of the tariffs in the Trump administration, so the 201 tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, and the 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, those tariffs remain in place, and we've collected more than $100 billion in additional tariffs. Most of that comes from China and the Section 301 tariffs, but not all of it clearly. So this has an impact. I think this is actually a drag on the recovery for our sector, which kind of makes it interesting to look at the average unit value data when we know that companies also, though, are paying these higher tariffs. So just a few slides on the key players in the Biden administration on trade policy. So the obvious, of course, is the U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine Tai. She's very well known in Washington. She had worked previously in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and then she had worked on Capitol Hill for the House Ways and Means Committee as their trade counsel. And what I think is interesting and what's been really clear from the start is that trade policy is a part of the larger Biden administration Build Back Better. But I wanted to include this quote from Katherine because she talked about, so what are the things that she's going to work on? Implementing and enforcing USMCA, rebuilding alliances, tackling climate change, ending the COVID-19 pandemic, advancing racial and gender equity, addressing issues from China. I mean, clearly there's a lot on the plate and a lot in this administration that's defined as trade policy that maybe you might not have thought of and in previous administrations wouldn't have been called part of the trade portfolio. Also really important is the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. And her focus, as usual at the Commerce Department, is to create jobs, focusing on U.S. jobs, build an economy that does not leave any communities behind. Similar to the USTR perspective, a focus, though, on trade and protecting U.S. jobs, protecting U.S. workers. Not so obvious for trade policy is the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. So this week he's in the Middle East and playing a traditional role for a Secretary of State. But I thought it was what I have noticed in the statements that come from the State Department is that they regularly mention trade and trade issues in those statements. And this quote that I used on this slide is talking about the free trade agreement talks with the United Kingdom, and that the administration wants to make sure that these agreements advance the well-being of workers and families. But the fact that the Secretary of State keeps trade policy as part of his discussion with world leaders, I think is a little bit different than some administrations and valuable to know. And last, and not at all who you might think, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, will be playing a very important role this summer. Why? Because she's leading the administration response to the immigration crisis at the border. And if we're going to talk about how to create jobs and enhance the economies close to home, Northern Triangle, and Central America, then obviously we're going to be talking about trade policy as well, and more on that later. So, trade policy today, let me just jump in with so what are some of the key issues? China remains the main target. Not only do we continue to have the 301 tariffs, the tariffs in place, and kind of this basic trade war footing with China. There's a lot of discussion about, will there be new tariffs? Will there be new sanctions against China? And we know that the Biden administration wants to show that they're going to be tough on representing U.S. interests with China. The administration is still conducting a whole of government review of U.S.-China U.S.-China relationship, not just trade, geopolitical relationship, cyber relationship. We might have thought that whole of government review would be finished in the first 100 days of the administration, but it's not. And in the meantime, in the Congress, they are eager to take action and to pass legislation that focuses on China and how to change our China policy, how to improve and expand enforcement. The Senate is debating this legislation this week. There was an expectation, well, we'll see what happens here. The Democrats had hoped to pass the legislation this week. There's some pushback from Republicans about it. And since we have a big holiday weekend coming up, the Senate will go out of session. So it's a real question. Will this legislation pass this week or not? But there definitely will be legislation that will pass the Congress. I'm sure the House and the Senate will go to conference and deal with their differences and come up with a piece of legislation that will pass. Probably sooner rather than later. There still has been no action, and I had to use this slide because I love the photos of some of these products that, for those of you who have been involved and hurt by the 301 tariffs and the trade war, also a little surprising is that the Biden administration hasn't taken action to renew the China product exclusions. So, some of the things that were on the product exclusion list and exempt from the tariffs, like backpacks and duffel bags and rugs, those are being assessed the duties now. Again, would have thought there would have been this action taken quicker, but it is part of the whole of government review, and no idea how long it's going to be until we see product exclusions either back in place or a shift in what the tariffs are covering. I have to also mention the Xinjiang forced labor issue, which continues to be a major issue for imports from China. And so this document, the Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory, came out last year. We expect a updated version to come from the administration soon. This is a top issue, obviously for Customs and Border Protection, but also broader within the administration as well. Talk a little bit more about that later too. So, if we look at the trade policy today and just kind of summarize here what's the focus, worker and labor rights are a top agenda item, whether it's with the USMCA, the US Mexico Canada Agreement, where we are seeing, a review of labor practices in one of the first cases, or when we're talking about Xinjiang, or looking at other labor issues across the board, it's a priority. Climate change and sustainability in many, maybe I should say most, of the administration presentations, they talk about climate change and sustainability and how it's a part of trade policy. Now, how that will be integrated in trade policy is a good question. A lot of the think tanks, and industry groups are talking about this. Perhaps it's more WTO negotiations. Some folks are pushing for some kind of carbon tax regime. It's a focus, although that policy is not clear. The migration crisis, that is obviously another top priority, and one of the areas where many observers feel the Biden administration has not done all that it could. And that's why earlier I wanted to just include the photo for the vice president, because she's heading to the region next month. I think there is a real interest in the administration to look at what might be done to help the economies in especially Northern Triangle and in Central America. And if you're going to talk about how to create jobs and how to build those economies, you have to be talking about the textile and apparel sector as one of the potential ways to create jobs and create jobs quickly. So I feel like there's a overlap here between, all right, we're not using the free trade agreement as much as we could, and we're looking for how can we create jobs in the region. It's a priority for the administration, and I think we will be talking a lot more about that going forward. And then cybersecurity, I feel like we have to add that everywhere. It's another priority for the Biden administration. And what does that mean? I mean, is that going to have an impact, say, on some of the platforms that we use, some of the marketplaces for e-commerce, other communications? Is that going to affect apps? I think that is something else that we're going to look at that will have a broader international approach as well. I felt like I had to give a little background to talk about, all right, what are some of the trade cases? What are the things that are potential for problems? And one of it is looking at the digital services taxes and trade cases that the Biden administration is using to push back on this. I mean, it all really started back in 2019 with France taking this action. We had a threat of retaliation. Right now, retaliation is delayed. There are talks at the OECD, but in the meantime, many countries are moving ahead with DST, with digital services taxes. And the Biden administration is taking as strong a view as the Trump administration did that this is not acceptable. So there's 6 cases under review, and we just had hearings with the U.S. Trade Representative's office about the proposals from Austria, India, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. USFIA, we filed comments because there are a lot of consumer products. There are textile products, there are rugs, there are handbags, there's apparel that are included in the retaliation lists that potentially could go into effect against imports from these countries. So, our argument is this is a tax issue. It should be dealt with as a tax issue. It should be dealt with through the OECD on a global basis, and not use trade policy and tariffs as the retaliation. But it is on the table, and it is definitely a concern for us going forward. You may remember from the Trump administration that there was a 301 case initiated against Vietnam that was looking at their currency and looking at illegal timber practices. The Biden administration hadn't taken any action, but yesterday the Commerce Department announced that currency undervaluation by Vietnam was a countervailable subsidy. That's the first time that a administration has taken that action, and that may suggest that may open the door to more countervailing duty cases, and potentially more action that focuses on Vietnam, which, of course, looking at our data, is exactly what we don't need. Myanmar, have to just say a word about Myanmar, because I get a lot of questions about this. And while we did have a ban on trade with Myanmar in the distant past, right now the Biden administration is watching closely what's happening on the ground. There is the potential for trade-related sanctions. The most obvious might be suspending their duty-free generalized system of preferences benefits, GSP benefits. I'm going to talk about GSP in a minute, but right now it's expired. So that's kind of something that could be a potential way to punish Myanmar if they don't start moving toward democracy. Also targeted sanctions, which don't tend to include trade sanctions. To move to trade sanctions, that probably would only go into effect if there is a longer term, dispute and not a return to democracy in Myanmar. So we're watching that very closely since this is one of the growing sourcing destinations. And finally, just to mention the Biden proposals to promote domestic production. So tax credits to manufacture in the US, the use of tax penalties and maybe eliminations of deductions for jobs moved overseas, encouraging the manufacture of PPE. All of this is part of the Biden proposals, and we'll be watching this closely as well to see what happens with the tax policy and how does that link to Made in USA. But that is definitely something that's on the agenda. And then we have a couple of trade program renewals. So GSP. It expired last December. It's expired before. It's expired many times, and every time there's a lapse, and then it'll be renewed retroactively. And we anticipate that'll be the same this time. The issue is on the agenda in the Congress, but the timing is uncertain. Kind of uncertain for two reasons. When I did this slide, I was thinking of the fact that many Democrats want to add new eligibility requirements to GSP. But also in the discussion on the China legislation this week, there was an effort to get renewal of GSP included, and the Democrats in the Senate said no, it's not. They're not going to add these trade provisions to the China bill. Even though apparel's not eligible, there are a lot of products that are. And so if we talk about, travel goods and handbags and flat goods, a lot of those products are eligible for GSP and have been sold to the US using GSP and thus duty free. So that last year, almost a quarter of the imports of those travel goods were duty free because of GSP. And of course, now everyone's paying duties on those. So this is an important issue for renewal for us. The miscellaneous tariff bill is similar. It's temporary duty suspensions. Most people don't use this provision, but for those who do, obviously there's a benefit to have duty-free access to the market. This expired also on December 31st, and we also are hoping for it to be renewed as soon as possible by the Congress, but again, timing is uncertain. And you'll note I've been very careful not to really talk about Congress and the dysfunction in Congress, but obviously it's not easy to get consensus. It's not easy to get legislation through right now. So, we're concerned that these trade renewals may take longer than they need to, but right now we don't have a clear path forward or a timeline. The last renewal hasn't actually expired yet, but Trade Promotion Authority, which is the authority that Congress gives to the administration to negotiate new trade agreements and have them come back for congressional consideration without Congress being able to renegotiate or revise the provisions in the agreement. It's a big deal, and definitely we would need Trade Promotion Authority if the Biden administration decides to continue the talks started in the Trump administration with the United Kingdom and with Kenya for free trade agreements. There also has been so much talk about might the Biden administration want to join CPTPP, the final version of what was the TPP negotiations during the Obama years. All of that would need Trade Promotion Authority. Once again, not likely to be renewed before July 1st, but it's another key issue, somewhere we need Congress to act if we're going to be able to have a new trade policy that is talking about new free trade agreements and new trading opportunities. So let me stop there. Thanks for the opportunity to share these thoughts today, and I do look forward to seeing everyone soon and hopefully next year in Miami. So thanks, and Jason, hopefully there are some questions for us to talk about.
All right. Technical glitch there. Let's see, no questions, but I do have a question. Some
Okay.
kind of we talked about briefly before we went live there. New administration, obviously it's very early in everything to see what progress is going to be made. A lot of updates need to be made, as you just mentioned. It seems, moreover, with labor rights, climate change, migrant crisis, cybersecurity, focus is in relatively the right area, but in terms of the trade war and in terms of getting legislation that's going to aid the ability to import products and cost savings incentives for US-based brands. How optimistic are you feeling with this new administration based on everything you've seen so far? I know that's a hard thing to kind of predict, but very different from the Trump administration. What are your thoughts overall on how things are shaping up so far?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I will say, working with the Biden administration is very different than the Trump administration. And, they definitely have been reaching out to industry, and to industry groups to, get feedback and input on the variety of issues that they're dealing with. Like I said, I mean, I wish they had taken quicker action to undo some of the things that the Trump administration did, like the 301 tariffs. But I think they are taking a measured approach. And they're taking an approach as well that, I want to go back to kind of the immigration crisis and looking at how can policy from multiple parts of the economy and the administration come together for a coherent policy to move forward and open markets and open trade. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric, and of course, with any Democratic administration, there's a focus on labor issues. But I think there also is, an almost equal recognition that opening markets is good for the U.S. and U.S. exports, as well as good for creating jobs in our trading partners. So, I mean, I'm pretty positive in that the administration has been, is looking for input, is taking input, seems to be carefully considering what they're hearing. But look forward for some action to start happening. I think this summer start moving forward.
Right. Looking forward to seeing your update in a year's time, hopefully on stage this time in Miami.
Yeah.
We did have one question come through, a very good one. Which sourcing regions thus far seem to have been the winner, quote unquote, winner of the COVID-19 pandemic? And if importers were to think of a few years down the road, where do you feel are the safest geopolitical areas to produce?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so the toughest question to answer is the last one, right? Where are the safest areas? Because I think the past few months it's been a reminder, right, that no place is totally safe. That there are geopolitical risks, there are natural disaster risks, right? That it's very hard to predict what happened. And if we think about the impact of COVID, when we met 2 years ago, like that, responding to a pandemic or any kind of global action wouldn't have been on our minds at all. So it's pretty hard to say where is safe. I mean, I think that, but I think that's why we're looking a lot at what people call near shoring, right? That looking at, are there more opportunities for sourcing closer to home, quicker, allowing some quicker response and quicker delivery of product to the US market. I mean, that's not always the case, but I think there's a renewed, looking at what are those opportunities, and will there be some ways that the Biden administration will help to encourage companies to take that action. If I just look at so far who have been the winners, I mean, the winners have been countries in Asia, other than China. I mean, and so even though China's our top supplier, and the growth from China this year, the rebound has been incredible. The fact is that a lot of companies have shifted production now, and maybe it's co-production, part China and part another country in the region, so that Asia, especially the Southeast Asia, but also South Asia, have really been the winners, and have really expanded their share of the U.S. market. Um, you know, to the detriment of China. I mean, even though we know like some of that's Chinese investment and some of that is using Chinese fabrics or Chinese inputs. The expansion in Asia is stronger today and a share of U.S. imports from Asia than they were before COVID.
Very interesting. All right. Thank you, Julie. It was very good to see you again. Look forward to seeing you again next year, and hopefully before then. Yet to be seen if we'll be doing your event in New York live in person. So hopefully that goes through okay.
I hope so. That would be terrific.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get some of the staff up there to go take a look if that does happen. Regardless, we'll be there anyway virtually. So no other questions we have right now. So Julia, again, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our viewers. I'd like to remind everybody to go ahead and check out our show pavilions on the trade show dashboard, as well as the show office, which is where you can engage with other speakers like Julie, and our ATS staff, our matchmaking staff that can help you with your sourcing needs. If you have any questions about any connections or resources you need, that's the place to do it, and engage with other attendees as well. So we'll be back here shortly with our next session. And Julia, you take care, and we'll see everybody soon.
Thank you. Thanks.